We begin with a film that takes its name from an apparent mishearing of Louis Malle's Au revoir les enfants, which, to be honest, to me suggests either a really garbled pronunciation, that Tarantino has an incredibly tin ear, or maybe it's a creation myth. But Scott, let's begin with that film, which is somehow transmuted Au revoir les enfants to Reservoir Dogs.
Yes, Reservoir Dogs covers in Tarantino's favoured non-linear fashion the planning and disastrous results of a diamond heist after it becomes apparent that there's a rat in the house. Said rat is Tim Roth's Mr. Orange, undercover cop who wormed his way into the good graces of the criminal organisation of Lawrence Tierney's Joe Cabot and his son Chris Penn's nice guy Eddie, and is now bleeding out on the floor of a dingy warehouse while Harvey Keitel's Mr. White, Steve Buscemi's Mr. Pink, and Michael Madsen's psychotic Mr. Blonde all point fingers and guns at each other. Oh, and don't worry about that cop sitting over in the corner, he won't be hearing anything. Tarantino's first film pretty much started as he meant to go on, jumping around in time and combining relatively obscure music choices with discordant actions, in this instance giving a generation an entirely new perspective on Steeler's Wheel. That ear-cutting scene in particular led to early criticisms of Tarantino's work being violent, gratuitously even, and perhaps in his later work that might even be fair to say, but I've always found Reservoir Dogs tame by the standards of any post-code time. Like most of his films, Reservoir Dogs is less about the narrative, hence my rather brief summation, but more about hanging out with the characters, and of course, the main Tarantino hallmark of the period, the dialogue, which, like Kevin Smith's contemporaneous work, is not particularly realistic, but is undeniably cool and fun. And at the risk of spoiling my metacriticism of every Tarantino film, I rather get the impression if you were to ask Tarantino why he wrote, shot, directed, etc., any part of any film he's made, the answer would be because I thought it would be cool and or funny. And as more often than not, I'm on his wavelength, that means there's a good number of films we were talking about here that I found cool and or funny. Reservoir Dogs, certainly, most certainly amongst them, but I'm not sure I've got a great deal more to say about them. All surface and no feeling, maybe. But with a surface this polished and with this many great turns and this much entertainment, it's very hard to be hard on it. Very accomplished and highly enjoyable debut, even all these years later. Yeah, very good stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much you can add to the conversation about this film at this point, but my observation of Reservoir Dogs, if I have to sum it up, would be that this is probably the single most significant calling card in terms of a director's debut in the last 30 years of cinema, if not the 30 years that also preceded it. I think culturally it's hard to emphasize what a kind of atom bomb this was going off, because it was the first film in a long time, I think, to sort of cross boundaries of pop culture, and it became a sort of a lifestyle statement for some people. It was just across all forms of media. It seemed to have this seismic impact on things, and for such a relatively small film with, like a micro budget and goodness knows, I don't know. I haven't actually read that much about the production of the film, for all that this is, I suspect, a really sort of formative cinematic experience for the three of us, given the age we were at when this arrived on the scene. I'm still not entirely sure what the story is behind how Tarantino managed to get the likes of Keitel on board, but in essence this is like micro budget filmmaking, and for something like that to have an impact, the only other film I can think of that culturally would even have come close, and it didn't cross the boundaries that this film did, it was just maybe as much of a talking point as it was for some point, was Blair Witch Project. But no one was putting up Blair Witch Project's posters on their wall. Blair Witch Project didn't reinvent and relaunch the movie soundtrack as a listening experience at home. Blair Witch Project wasn't being quoted by kids in school grounds up and down the land. It's just kind of unfathomable what an impact such a sort of small piece of filmmaking actually had.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking when I wrote my notes up, I was thinking, I've seen Reservoir Dogs dozens of times, at least half a dozen. Then I thought back and was like, no, I've seen this now 3 times. But I remember it all incredibly clearly. I could have recited essentially most of the script from memory. So it's one of these films that just had one of these bolts from the blue on a young, impressionable lad that really was incredibly memorable and impactful. And yeah, it's certainly stuck with me for an awfully long time.
There are synapses in our brains which have developed around this film.
Yeah.
Yeah. To pick up from what you were saying, Craig, though, and to go back to my comment about creation myth, I think you don't want to dwell too much on the whole micro-budget thing, because Reservoir Dogs didn't have a micro budget. And that's the idea I had in my head. that it was like meant to be shot on a very small amount of money. I was thinking very much about this when I watched this last week, and I'm thinking, there was no way it was made in that much money. Look at the crew. Even if nothing else, like, look at the crew. And yeah, okay, it wasn't made on a lot of money, but it wasn't made on a micro budget.
The actual creation myth is Quentin Tarantino's really lucky. Seems to be how it goes. He was incredibly
yeah, by all accounts.
But, so it goes to the producer, Lawrence Bender. He gives the script to Harvey Keitel, and Keitel himself liked it and decided to sign up as a co-producer, and then that made it, because like Harvey Keitel on board, you get an awful lot.
You can have money now.
Get money, and they got $1.5 million.
Okay.
That's an awful lot more than they kind of like the idea. The number I had in my head was like around $60,000 or something.
Yeah, that's the ballpark figure I was thinking.
And it's like that's why I was like so skeptical watching this. Like, there's no way. Not just because it looks so good. You can be creative there, but it's like I kept looking at the crew, the huge number of people on the crew for a film that only has like 8 characters and a couple of locations. Like no, it's considerably more than that. So I think it's creation myth. I think it isn't that.
Still, essentially, from a studio perspective, chump change though, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I mean, they did well, and they've got. I mean, actors like Steve Buscemi, I don't think were particularly well known then, certainly are now. But I mean, he's assembled a great cast, made a really good job of it. But I think I don't know enough about Tarantino to suggest that he lied, but perhaps he didn't do anything to dissuade people when they got the wrong idea, because it builds his mythos, doesn't it?
Well, more power to him.
But yeah, I don't have an awful lot to add to what either of you have said. I've seen this dozens of times, Scott, but I've enjoyed it every time. I just find the soundtrack's brilliant and the dialogue is so entertaining. I really like the diegetic use of sound that's like starts on a car radio or something, but then becomes like just a normal non-diegetic soundtrack. And like, the way that's mixed is really, really well done. So technically, that's really well done. Yeah, the big issues I have with it are just the same issues I have with a lot of Tarantino stuff. Is like, why are these characters all so racist? Like, they have to, or misogynist, or in this case both. Like, do they have to be like that all the time? All your characters like this? And I don't think that Quentin Tarantino is racist, but he seems to be awfully fond of making his characters like that. And I think I don't think he's racist without knowing the man personally, but I kind of think he's a bit tone deaf. And when you have all your characters like in the car on their way to like checking out the joint, and they're talking about like what black women would do and what white women would do and all that stuff, like, is it really necessary? He writes such entertaining dialogue. Does it have to be dialogue about that in almost every film he makes?
Yeah. Of course, he leans into that later on in his career, but it does kind of pervade all the earlier stuff as well, to no real benefit to anyone. Yeah, it's a bit of a strange choice, yeah.
You kind of get the feeling that, look, you could write dialogue about this if it was, of this quality, if they were having a conversation about their favourite pancake house. You know what I mean? Why did you need to make it something that's so edgy?
We'll come on to it shortly, but like when I said in my introduction that like so much of his dialogue is about just everyday stuff. Look at the start of Pulp Fiction. In Pulp Fiction, after the diner scene, they're talking about hamburgers, right? It's fascinating. I could listen to that all day. It doesn't have to be offensive as well.
Yeah.
So like some of his settings, it makes sense, but it seems he just goes so heavy in it. Sometimes I'm like, why is that there? Why was they deem that necessary?
Yeah, it doesn't need to be an edgelord all the time. Yeah,
it seems a bit much. It's like,
well, it doesn't seem to have hurt his career. So I wonder if perhaps being an edgelord was part of that, ego building exercise and part of the self promotion. I mean, because it certainly generated enough conversation around his work, didn't it? And there's no such thing as bad publicity. So I don't know, but yeah, no, I think it is something that, going back now, I don't think necessarily 20 odd years ago it was something that was troubling me to listen to. I think I was just probably too young, too naive, and too overwhelmed to consider that now. But given the sort of social paradigm shifts that we're going through now, it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb.
Yeah, I'm sure we probably all thought it was cool, and it's not that I have a problem with any one example of dialogue, particularly with watching all of his films within 1 week. I'm like,
it's more the pattern really that is established that's concerning. Yeah.